At Cedar Ridge Regional Airport, Hunter Cole had one quiet warning to offer. The small runway at the valley floor was not safe for departure when the fog rolled in. Charlotte Whitman, a 29-year-old CEO rushing to Denver to sign the biggest deal of her life, looked at his faded uniform jacket, at the 6-year-old girl standing quietly beside him, and she laughed. She called it the travel advice of a car driver. 17 minutes later, the private jet sat grounded on the taxiway, and Captain Joseph Reed stepped out to find Hunter. "You were right. You just saved everyone." Cedar Ridge Regional Airport sat at the bottom of a bowl. That was the best way to describe it. A modest facility pressed between low ridgelines and the lazy bend of a slow river, with a single runway long enough to handle mid-size business jets on a calm afternoon, but barely adequate when the weather decided otherwise. The terminal was a low rectangular building with amber fluorescent lighting, scuffed linoleum floors, a small FBO counter, and a weather display monitor mounted at a slight tilt near the coordination desk. 2 baggage carts sat idle outside the glass doors. A windsock at the far end of the field barely stirred. Hunter Cole arrived for his evening shift just after 4 o'clock. He wore a dark navy uniform jacket that had seen enough winters to soften at the collar and fade at the cuffs. His khaki trousers were pressed. His leather shoes were old but clean. He moved through the terminal without announcing himself and went directly to what mattered. He checked the flight board first, then the ground transport schedule, then the highway conditions along the routes connecting Cedar Ridge to Oak Ridge International 40 miles north, then the regional weather briefing for that evening. He did this without being told to, without drawing attention to it. It was the order of operations he had carried since his years, working flight coordination for a regional carrier, a role that had trained him to treat every late afternoon sky as a problem worth solving before it announced itself. Violet Cole sat in the small chair behind the coordination counter, her legs dangling above the floor, arms wrapped around a worn stuffed rabbit she had named Oliver. She was 6 years old, with her father's quiet eyes and the patient composure of a child who had learned early that waiting was simply part of being loved by someone with a job to do. Her school had released early for a staff development day, and there was no one else to take her, so here she was. She did not complain. She watched. Hunter was not a simple ground coordinator by training. Before Violet was old enough to form clear memories, he had held a flight operations coordination role at a regional carrier, reading METAR reports and TAF forecasts as easily as most people read a morning headline. He had managed visibility windows, cross-referenced dew point spreads and cloud ceilings, tracked alternate airport availability, and learned the particular personalities of a dozen regional airports, which ones closed fast, which ones held, which ones looked clear from a mile out, and disappeared completely by the time you were committed. He had left that career after his wife passed away. The rotating shifts and overnight calls had been manageable when there were 2 of them sharing the weight. They stopped being manageable the afternoon. He was alone with a 5-year-old who needed breakfast made and medicine given, and a parent who could actually be present. Cedar Ridge had offered steadier hours and a shorter commute. He had taken it without resentment and without explanation. That evening, standing at the weather monitor with a cold cup of coffee in his left hand and his eyes on the forecast band, he watched fog beginning to settle along the far fence line of the runway. It was faint, the kind of thin white layer that made casual observers dismiss it as nothing worth noting. Hunter knew better. He had seen this signature before. Humidity approaching saturation, temperature dropping toward the dew point, cool air funneling in off the river bend at the valley's lowest edge. It started thin, then it closed. Diana Walsh, the FBO manager, came to stand beside him. She looked toward the ramp, then at the monitor, then at Hunter. "Whitman's flight is supposed to go at 6:30, she said. "Do you think they're still clear?" Hunter did not answer immediately. He looked at the wind direction indicator. He checked the updated forecast band scrolling across the bottom of the screen. He looked at the clock. "If they're not wheels up in the next 20 minutes, he said quietly, they should consider relocating to Oak Ridge. This valley closes fast once it starts." Diana nodded, but said nothing. She had known Hunter long enough to take his calm seriously. Outside, a line of black vehicles turned off the highway and moved toward the FBO entrance. Whatever was about to happen at Cedar Ridge Regional Airport that evening, it was not going to be ordinary. Charlotte Whitman moved through a room the way a weather front moved through a valley. You felt it before you fully registered it. She was 29 years old, dressed in a cream-colored suit, with a silk blouse the shade of warm, ivory, nude heels that added 3 inches to her already assured posture, and hair the dark gold color of late autumn pulled back with practiced neatness. She was objectively beautiful and precisely aware of it, though that was not the quality that made people step aside. It was the certainty she carried, the unexamined confidence of someone whose schedule had always, eventually, bent to accommodate her. Behind her came Dominic Hale, her COO, mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with the expression of a man who had long ago decided that urgency was a management tool. Beside him was Grace Miller, Charlotte's personal assistant, carrying a laptop bag, a folder of contracts, and a phone that had been ringing for the better part of an hour. Charlotte was attempting to reach Denver before 9 o'clock to close a corporate acquisition worth several $100 million. The target was a logistics firm whose board had been quietly courted by a competing buyer for 3 weeks. The signing window was narrow and conditional. If Charlotte's team was not in the room with the right signatures in hand, the competing party's legal team, already positioned in Denver, already prepared, would use the delay to reopen terms that had taken months to negotiate. The deal was not only about money. The Whitman Group's board had never entirely silenced its skepticism about Charlotte's leadership. She had taken the CEO chair at 27, following her father Jackson Whitman's planned transition, and certain board members had never fully accepted the logic. This acquisition was the argument that was supposed to close the conversation permanently. The private jet was parked on the ramp, polished and prepared. Captain Joseph Reed had been completing pre-flight checks for the past hour. He was 61 years old, lean and gray-haired, methodical in the way that pilots with more than 30 years in the air tended to be. He did not hurry through things. He also did not ignore them. Charlotte reached the FBO counter and asked why the final clearance was taking longer than usual. Dominic scanned the small terminal with the practiced impatience of someone whose time was a currency and small airports were the equivalent of a blocked ATM. His gaze landed on Hunter, standing near the coordination desk with the weather printout in his hand, and Violet seated 3 feet behind him on the small chair. "Is the driver ready?" Dominic asked, of no one in particular, in the tone of a man who expected action rather than an answer. Hunter looked up briefly from the printout, then back at it. "Captain Reed should check the latest fog trend before pushing back," he said, addressing Diana rather than Dominic, keeping his voice measured. "Cedar Ridge has a low visibility threshold on this end of the field, and there's no approach lighting support comparable to what Oak Ridge has. If the departure window is critical, leaving now or relocating to Oak Ridge are both viable options. Waiting past 7 o'clock is not." Charlotte had heard approximately 2/3 of this, which was enough to irritate her. This day had already included a board member's cautionary call that morning, 2 emails from the Denver counterparty about timeline discipline, and a terse voicemail from Dominic, reminding her what a failed signing would look like in the morning coverage. She was not in a condition to receive more problems from more people. Dominic offered a thin smile. "We're not paying for travel advice from the luggage department," he said. A few people near the counter shifted. Not dramatically, just the involuntary reorganization of people who had heard something they were not quite comfortable with. Violet heard it. She said nothing. She pulled Oliver a little more tightly against her chest. Hunter did not adjust his tone or his expression. He addressed the substance. "The aircraft is fine," he said. "The airport is not equipped for this condition. Visibility will drop below departure minimums, and if you haven't left by then, the captain cannot legally clear you for takeoff. The delay from waiting out the fog here will far exceed the 30 minutes it takes to drive to Oak Ridge." Charlotte looked at him with the particular coolness of someone who had already categorized the speaker and did not see cause to reconsider. "I hired a pilot," she said, "not a consultant." She turned toward Grace and told her to call Denver and confirm wheels up in 10 minutes. Hunter made one final attempt, not because he expected a different result, because a departure grounding in bad conditions was a worse outcome than being ignored in a good one, and he was a man who had long ago learned to distinguish between the discomfort of being dismissed and the danger of letting something dangerous go unremarked. He explained it as simply as he could. Cedar Ridge sat in a natural depression. When fog formed off the river, it did not spread evenly across the valley it stratified, layering in horizontal bands that could make the runway threshold look open from a distance, while the far end had already vanished entirely. There was no instrument landing system at Cedar Ridge with the precision to compensate. No runway centerline lighting. No high-intensity approach path guidance with adequate range for the closure rate he was describing. The difference between departing now and departing 12 minutes from now was not a marginal one. It could be the difference between a clean departure and a rejected takeoff with no viable abort margin. Charlotte looked at him the way a person looked at something they had already decided was beside the point. She saw the scuffed shoes, the faded jacket collar, the employee badge from a regional airport most of her contacts could not have found on a map, the 6-year-old girl behind the luggage counter with a stuffed animal. She assembled these facts into a conclusion and trusted it completely. "If you knew this much about flight schedules," she said, in the even tone of someone delivering an observation rather than a cruelty, "I imagine you wouldn't still be parking cars for a living." The room went quiet for one beat. Not the theatrical silence of a dramatic confrontation, just the brief, involuntary stillness of people who had heard something that landed harder than expected. Diana Walsh looked at Charlotte with undisguised disapproval. Grace Miller glanced up from her laptop. Something shifted in her expression, not quite surprise, but the recognition that the comment had been sharper than the situation required. Dominic said nothing, but the faint satisfaction in his posture made clear he had no objection to watching someone put in their place. Violet heard every word. She did not understand the full weight of the professional context, but she understood that her father had been mocked in front of strangers and that he had been trying to help. She stepped down from her chair and walked over to Hunter, her fingers closing around the hem of his jacket. Hunter put his hand on her shoulder. He did not raise his voice. He did not match the sharpness with sharpness of his own. He said, "I hope you reach Denver safely, Miss Whitman. That is why I said it." Charlotte turned back to Grace and repeated the order. "Call Denver, confirm departure in 10 minutes. Joseph Reed had been standing near the ramp door, listening with the neutrality of a man trained to absorb information before reacting to it. He did not smile at Charlotte's remark, nor did he move away. He walked over to Hunter and asked quietly what he had observed on the weather monitor. Hunter walked him through it. Wind direction, temperature relative to dew point, moisture at saturation, the observed rate of fog advance along the fence line, the estimated timeline to below minimum visibility at Cedar Ridge, and a brief comparison to Oak Ridge's current reported conditions. Joseph's face did not change, but the quality of his stillness changed. He said he would run an additional check with operations before final pushback authorization. Dominic, who had been watching this exchange from across the room, moved toward them. "We have a timeline," he said. Joseph looked at him directly. "Weather makes more decisions than anyone in this room." It was not a threat. It was a fact. But it was the first fact that made Charlotte's timeline feel fragile. Outside, the last of the runway threshold lights blurred behind a thin white layer that had not been there 15 minutes ago. Charlotte settled into the forward cabin of the jet, with the controlled composure of someone holding stress at arm's length through sheer discipline. Dominic sat across from her, tablet open, reading from an email thread that had been accumulating urgency since late afternoon. Grace sat further back, her laptop open, but her eyes intermittently on the terminal window where the fog had begun to press against the glass. On the ramp, Hunter and the ground crew completed the final departure support procedures. He checked the wheel chocks, the baggage bay seal, the pushback cart clearance angles. He was precise and methodical. Whatever had happened inside the FBO had no visible effect on the quality of his work. This was not performance, and it was not stoicism. It was simply how he was built. The job in front of him mattered regardless of whether the people receiving it had treated him with decency. In the cockpit, Joseph Reed pulled the latest weather update from operations. The numbers were moving in the wrong direction, and moving faster than the forecast model had anticipated. Dew point spread was down to less than 1 degree Celsius. Humidity had reached saturation. The fog bank advancing from the southwest had already reached the taxiway edge markers on the far side of the field. Cedar Ridge had no Category 2 approach equipment, no centerline lighting, no high-intensity precision approach path guidance. The company's operations manual was unambiguous. If reported visibility fell below published departure minimums, the captain was not authorized to commence the takeoff roll. This was not a guideline. It was not a suggestion. It was the kind of rule that existed because, without it, certain nights ended badly. Dominic appeared at the cockpit doorway. He did not ask a question. He said, "What is our departure window?" Joseph did not look up from the instrument panel. "Narrow. Are we taking it?" "I'll tell you when I've confirmed." Dominic lowered his voice the way men accustomed to authority sometimes did when they wanted to imply consequence without stating it directly. He mentioned the timeline, the figures attached to the deal, and the company's reliance on this crew. There was a version of this that could have been reasonable context. The way Dominic delivered it did not allow for that reading. Joseph turned in his seat. "Every wrong decision has a cost," he said evenly. "Some of them can't be settled with money." He requested pushback clearance to the runway threshold for a final visibility assessment before any departure commitment. This was standard procedure, not a statement. It was due diligence. The jet moved slowly out onto the taxiway. In the cabin, Charlotte watched the clock on her phone. Dominic stared at the runway lights through the porthole. Grace looked out at the fog, then at her own reflection in the glass. Hunter had remained just inside the terminal door, Violet beside him. Violet had not said much since the incident at the counter. Now she looked up at her father's profile and asked, very softly, "Dad, is the airplane going to fly?" Hunter watched the jet's tail lights sweep slowly through the thickening white air. He did not want to frighten her. "I hope they wait," he said. From the operations desk, Samuel Brooks passed the latest visibility report through the ground frequency. The figure had fallen below published departure minimums. A maintenance vehicle at the far end of the ramp confirmed the same. The far field lights were no longer visible from the service road. Joseph halted the aircraft. In the cabin, the deceleration was gentle enough that Charlotte might have attributed it to a normal pause if Dominic had not immediately leaned forward and asked what was happening. The interphone tone preceded Joseph's voice by 2 seconds. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are holding position. Visibility has dropped below safe operating minimums. We will update you as conditions develop." Charlotte said nothing. Her face had gone pale. Dominic's first instinct was blame. He distributed it evenly outward at the airport equipment, at the forecast service, at the unnecessary warnings that had unsettled the departure sequence. The jet sat where it was. Conditions continued to worsen. There was no more window to debate. Joseph turned the aircraft back toward the ramp. When the cabin door opened and the stairs extended to the tarmac, Captain Joseph Reed did not go looking for Charlotte Whitman. He walked toward the terminal window, searching for Hunter Cole. Joseph descended the jet stairs with his cap in his hand, and the particular gravity of a man who understood precisely what had nearly happened. Charlotte followed, still composed in the brittle way of people who have not yet determined how to feel. Dominic came down last, his expression arranged into something between irritation and calculation. Samuel Brooks stood near the ramp entrance. When Dominic demanded to know if the airport had overreacted, Samuel said 2 words, "Captain's call." Joseph walked past them. He found Hunter near the coordination counter. Violet resettled in her chair with Oliver back in her arms. Diana Walsh stood behind the FBO desk. Grace had paused halfway across the room. "Where did you do your operations work?" Joseph asked. Hunter had no interest in making the moment theatrical. "Regional carrier," he said. "Flight coordination. Before I came here." Joseph turned to look at Charlotte, who had come to stand 6 feet back, Grace at her shoulder. He read the trend correctly, Joseph said, and his voice carried the flat, considered authority of a man delivering a report rather than an opinion. Not just the fog level, the rate of advance, the way this valley closes. He described the mechanism precisely. If we had pushed to departure with another 4 or 5 minutes of delay added to what we already had, we would have been committed to the roll with no clean abort margin, or stationary on the taxiway with visibility fully gone and no viable option back. Charlotte was silent. She was not accustomed to being corrected in front of her team, but she was even less accustomed to being corrected by her own pilot, and that distinction changed the weight of it entirely. "Miss Whitman," Joseph said. Without cruelty or theater, He was not slowing you down. He was trying to stop you from making a very poor decision at the worst possible moment to make it. Dominic, who had been listening with his arms crossed, shifted his weight and said that if Hunter's concern had been legitimate, proper channels existed for communicating it. A formal weather advisory, a written recommendation routed through operations. Not a conversation at the FBO counter that unsettled the entire departure sequence. Diana Walsh answered before Hunter could. He did advise, she said. He was dismissed. Grace confirmed this without inflection. He was very specific and completely polite. Dominic said nothing more, but the calculation in his expression had not changed. He was already revising the story into something he could carry forward. Violet had been watching Charlotte throughout this exchange. Children noticed what adults had learned to conceal: the small flinch before a face steadied itself, the slight drop of someone's chin when certainty gave way. Violet's eyes were not accusatory. They were simply open. And their openness made Charlotte think about the sentence she had delivered at the FBO counter: clean, precise, perfectly calibrated to demean, and she could feel it now, the way you feel something you cannot take back. Charlotte wanted to say something adequate. The words did not come in the right order. Instead, she asked Joseph whether any path to Denver remained. He said not from Cedar Ridge, not for several hours at minimum. But Oak Ridge International, 40 miles north, had the equipment and staffing to operate in current conditions. There might still be a window if they moved quickly. Hunter heard this. He said nothing. He had already offered himself once that evening and been turned away, and he had no interest in presenting himself for the same rejection twice. Then Grace turned toward him. "Mr. Cole," she said quietly, "earlier you mentioned Oak Ridge. Is there still time?" Every person in the room looked at Hunter. Not one of them smiled. Hunter looked at the operations clock. He looked at the traffic advisory on Samuel's terminal. He looked at the weather display one more time. "There is a way," he said, "but everyone follows the route I give. No detours, and no pressure on the driver to exceed safe conditions." He walked through the plan without ornament. The main highway north was compromised at the River Bridge overpass fog, built dense there on evenings like this, and a low-speed advisory had already been issued for that stretch. The northern pass through the ridge was shorter in miles, but dangerous in wet conditions for the size and weight of Charlotte's vehicles. That left Mill Road, an older service route running alongside the agricultural district and looping east behind the industrial park before connecting to Oak Ridge International's South Gate. It was not a shortcut. It was a longer route with better conditions. The difference between them was what mattered tonight. Dominic made the observation that a ground coordinator was now directing a corporate convoy. He said it with the tone of a man who expected agreement from the room. No one agreed. Joseph asked Hunter for the time estimate. Hunter said, if they departed Cedar Ridge within 8 minutes, maintained a consistent pace, and did not stop, they could reach Oak Ridge before the charter repositioning window closed for passenger intake. Charlotte looked at him. "How do you know about the charter window?" Hunter explained. When he had first observed the fog advancing, he had done what his operations years had trained him to do: look for alternatives before they were needed. He had checked the public flight operations log for Oak Ridge and called a contact at that FBO to confirm availability. There was a small commercial aircraft repositioning to Denver that evening, taking on last-minute passengers under a charter arrangement. He had made the call not because he expected gratitude, but because maintaining a contingency was a habit he had never managed to unlearn. Charlotte stood very still. The man she had dismissed at the counter had spent the intervening time quietly assembling her exit. She agreed to the route. Dominic made a sound that was not agreement, but was no longer refusal. Charlotte's decision had removed the structural basis for his objection, and he was practical enough to recognize when a position was no longer tenable. Grace transferred the contract folders to the convoy vehicles. Joseph called Oak Ridge to confirm the passenger count and hold the boarding window. Samuel Brooks opened the facility's service gate to reduce egress time. Diana Walsh appeared from the staff room with a thermos of coffee and a small fleece blanket, pressing it into Hunter's hands with a look that required no words. Charlotte noticed Violet climbing into the lead vehicle beside her father. She paused and asked quietly whether the child should stay at the FBO while Hunter drove. Hunter said no, his shift had nearly ended, The roads were foggy and unfamiliar in the dark, and he did not leave Violet behind in those conditions. The answer was calm and unambiguous, and it said something Charlotte had not thought to consider, that every decision Hunter Cole made, including the professional ones, was made with the understanding that his daughter was his first responsibility. The convoy left Cedar Ridge Regional Airport in a line of 3 vehicles, amber headlights cutting into white air. The road narrowed quickly as the valley gave way to the flatlands beyond the airport perimeter. Charlotte's phone was ringing. Dominic's tablet was open to the email thread from Denver. The dashboard clock read 6:51. The charter window at Oak Ridge would close at 7:42. In the lead vehicle, Hunter held his speed steady. He did not push for Dominic's benefit. He did not explain himself. He drove the road he knew. Near the Mill Road junction, a line of red brake lights materialized in the fog ahead, unmoving. A delivery truck had lost traction on the bridge approach and come to rest across the outer lane. The backup ahead was 4 vehicles deep and building. Dominic, in the second car, was on his phone within 30 seconds. He wanted police escort. He wanted someone to clear the road. He wanted something done about it, in the tone of a man for whom obstruction was a personal affront. Hunter had already moved. Before Dominic finished his first sentence, he had eased the lead vehicle onto a narrow secondary lane, branching off beside a long agricultural storage building, a turn that appeared on no navigation application, but that Hunter had used on a dozen logistics runs between Cedar Ridge and the industrial district. The road was single lane, low traffic, and it bypassed the bridge entirely, rejoining the main arterial 2 miles ahead on the clear side of the bottleneck. It was not a dramatic maneuver. It was simply a decision made without panic and without wasted time. Charlotte watched him from the passenger seat. She had ridden with enough high-urgency drivers over the years, men and women who accelerated through uncertainty, executives who treated speed as a substitute for competence, to recognize the difference between someone performing confidence and someone possessing it. Hunter was performing nothing. He held the wheel without tension. He read the road in the fog with the same quiet focus he had applied to the weather monitor at Cedar Ridge, and there was no gap between those two activities, because for him, they were the same activity, seeing what was actually there and responding to it. In the back seat, Violet had leaned slightly forward to watch the road through the windshield gap. When the fog thickened around a dark intersection and the headlights caught nothing but white, she gripped Oliver and went very still. Hunter checked the mirror. "I can see the road, Vi," he said, his voice low and even. "We go slow, and we get there." She settled back into her seat. Charlotte, who had been watching, looked away. Grace had moved into the second row at the last stop and now reached toward Violet, asking whether she was warm enough and offering the blanket Diana had packed. Violet thanked her. The child's manners were easy and unprompted, not the performance of a child coached to make good impressions, but simply the result of being raised by someone who had modeled decency quietly and consistently for 6 years. Grace asked Hunter how long he had been at Cedar Ridge. It was a gentle question, offered as conversation rather than inquiry. Hunter answered without deflecting. His wife had died 2.5 years earlier, a prolonged illness that arrived without adequate warning and left without adequate closure. He had been working flight coordination shifts at the time. After she passed, the rotating schedule had stopped being compatible with what Violet needed. A 6-year-old needed someone who was there in the morning, at dinner, when the fever spiked at 2 in the morning. Cedar Ridge had offered him the right hours for less prestige, and he had made the trade without drama. He said this the same way he described fog patterns and alternate routes, as information about conditions and the decisions they required. Charlotte had been listening without contributing. She had spent years constructing the argument that her ambitions were rational and her sacrifices meaningful, and they were. But sitting in this car, in this fog, listening to a man describe why he had walked away from a career title to be present for a child who now sat 4 feet behind her, she felt the narrow insufficiency of the categories she had been using to evaluate people. Her phone rang. Jackson Whitman, her father, and the board member she most needed on her side. She answered. He asked why she was not already in the air. She started to say it was the airport, the forecast, the aircraft. She heard those words forming, and she stopped. She looked at Hunter's hands on the wheel. "I dismissed a warning I should have taken," she said. "I'm correcting it." The line was quiet for a moment. Dominic, trailing in the second vehicle, was sending messages. Grace, watching the glass beside her, caught enough of a reflection to read the tone of what he was composing. A version of the evening in which an overeager ground employee had intervened inappropriately in the departure sequence, created unnecessary delays, and disrupted a time-sensitive executive operation. He was not done yet, but he was working. Oak Ridge International appeared as a broad wash of light through the fog on the horizon, its approach towers and ramp arc lighting visible from half a mile out. Grace looked at her phone. 11 minutes remained before the charter intake window closed. Oak Ridge International was not a large airport by national standards, but it was built for conditions like this one. It had instrument landing equipment, runway centerline lighting, a staffed weather operations center, and an FBO that handled business and charter traffic without the particular strain that tested smaller facilities. The fog was present here too, but it was being navigated around rather than shutting the field down. The south entrance required a security clearance check, and Dominic immediately moved to accelerate it by invoking Charlotte's name. Hunter said from the driver's seat, "They'll go slower if they feel pressured. They always do." Charlotte told Dominic to stand down. 3 minutes later, the convoy was through. Hunter pulled the lead vehicle directly to the charter reception lane without being asked. Charlotte noticed this and said nothing. She had stopped asking how Hunter knew things. At the counter, the operations agent informed them that the charter passenger list had officially closed. However, a call from Cedar Ridge Captain Joseph Reed, who had reached Oak Ridge operations by phone while the convoy was still on Mill Road, had placed a temporary hold on the final manifest pending confirmation of an emergency commercial reroute. It was a technicality. It was the only technicality that mattered. The hold required a payment authorization and a finalized passenger declaration. Dominic reached for his phone to pull up the authorization file from email, but the connection was dropping and the download stalled. He refreshed twice. The operations agent glanced at the clock. Grace opened the outer pocket of her document bag and produced a printed backup of the Whitman Group's charter authorization and passenger documentation, a precaution she had added to her packing routine after a similar procedural delay 14 months earlier. She placed it on the counter without ceremony. The agent processed it in 90 seconds. Hunter stood back from the group near the corridor wall, Violet against his side, one hand on her shoulder. He watched the counter exchange with the detachment of a man who had carried a package to the door and was waiting to confirm it had been signed for. He had no interest in the acknowledgement. He simply needed to see the right people pass through the right gate. Charlotte saw him standing there. She had been watching him, intermittently, all evening the way someone watches a person they have misjudged when the full shape of the misjudgment is still settling into focus. She thought about what she had said at the Cedar Ridge counter. She thought about Violet hearing it. She thought about the fact that Hunter, since that moment, had not once turned his correctness into leverage. He could have said, "I told you." He had the standing for it. He had said nothing except what was useful to the problem at hand. Before she passed through the security gate, she turned. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I was wrong earlier. What I said was unfair." He looked at her steadily. "You still have time to get there safely," he said. "That's what matters." It was the worst possible response she could have received, because it cost him nothing and demonstrated everything. The charter flight lifted from Oak Ridge International 11 minutes later. Joseph Reed, who had repositioned to Oak Ridge in the interim, confirmed the departure with Cedar Ridge operations and then placed a call to the Whitman Group's board line to verify the schedule and the circumstances. On the aircraft, Charlotte looked down as the valley disappeared into white below. Cedar Ridge was gone into the fog. She could not have found it from altitude. She thought about a man and his daughter driving back through the same fog on the same road, in the same car, toward a small apartment and a chapter book left open on a nightstand. Her father was waiting on the board line. He asked her again who Hunter Cole was. Charlotte took a long moment. "The person I wasn't humble enough to listen to," she said. The Denver meeting room was a long, glass-walled space above the city lights, furnished with the kind of restraint that communicated serious money without announcing it. Charlotte arrived 47 minutes behind schedule, which was late but not unrecoverable. The counterparty's lead attorney had already drafted language claiming a material breach of the timeline. The competing buyer's representative was in the adjacent conference room. Dominic had not been idle during the flight. By the time the wheels touched down at Denver International, he had constructed a narrative. In his version, the Cedar Ridge evening had unfolded as follows. An overreaching local ground employee had raised unverified safety objections outside established protocol, causing the crew and executives to engage with unconfirmed information that disrupted the departure sequence. The team had successfully rerouted through sound executive judgment and Dominic's operational knowledge. Hunter's name appeared once as the source of the disruption. It was a carefully assembled account, and if it stood, Hunter Cole, a man with no communications team, no corporate standing, and no visibility beyond a regional airport, would be held responsible for a $100 million deal nearly failing. A man raising a daughter alone on a modest income would pay for the arrogance of people who had far more than he did. Grace had read the draft on the flight. She had said nothing to Dominic. She had shown it to Charlotte. She had also forwarded Charlotte the time-stamped notes she had been keeping since Cedar Ridge. The exact time Hunter first gave his warning, what he said, and to whom, when Joseph initiated the additional weather check, when the visibility report fell below minimums, when the aircraft returned to the ramp, what Dominic had said while pressuring the captain, and the verbatim content of the FBO counter-exchange, including the sentence Charlotte had delivered about parking cars. Charlotte read through the document in the car from the airport. She read it once. Then she sat with it. In the conference room, the counterparty's attorney opened with the delay and what he suggested it implied about operational reliability. He asked whether a company that could not manage a single domestic flight could be trusted to integrate a logistics network spanning 11 regional distribution hubs. Charlotte stood. She did not reach for the prepared talking points. She said that the evening had not gone according to plan because she had been wrong at the beginning of it. She had received an accurate safety assessment from a person whose experience she had dismissed based on the way he was dressed and the title on his badge. She had prioritized her schedule over the judgment of someone who understood the conditions better than anyone in her convoy. She had been corrected by her pilot, by the weather itself, and eventually by her own conscience, and she had arrived late as a result of the first decision and still arrived at all as a result of the second. She said that the same quality, allowing her to correct course on a fog-covered service road outside Cedar Ridge, was the quality she brought to the acquisition they were discussing. The room held its silence for a beat longer than expected. Jackson Whitman, attending by video, watched his daughter for a long moment. He had taught her, years ago, that leadership was not a matter of speaking the most or holding the highest position. It was a matter of recognizing who was right before it was too late to act on it. Joseph Reed confirmed the sequence from a conference call. Samuel Brooks forwarded the weather operations log with timestamps. Diana Walsh confirmed that Hunter had given the reroute recommendation before conditions degraded below minimums. Dominic's account met the facts and fell apart quietly. The deal was signed at 11:42 that evening. Charlotte did not celebrate. She sat in the hotel room afterward and thought about Cedar Ridge, the fog, the weather monitor, a man standing at the coordination desk with his daughter beside him, doing his job completely and expecting nothing in return. The apology she had offered at the Oak Ridge gate had been real but incomplete. It had been addressed to the situation. It needed to be addressed to the person. Cedar Ridge in the morning was different from Cedar Ridge at night. The fog had burned off by 8 o'clock, leaving the valley sky the pale, clear blue that follows a night of moisture. The runway was empty. The terminal was quiet. Hunter arrived early. He had an administrative handover to finish, and Violet had school at 8:40. He had not tracked the Denver outcome. He had done his part, which ended at the Oak Ridge South Gate, and he had driven home through thinning fog with Violet asleep in the back seat and Oliver the rabbit on the dashboard. He had made dinner, put Violet to bed, and read to her until she fell asleep. Then he had slept himself. The black car at the FBO entrance was not what he had expected to find. Charlotte had come back without the convoy. No entourage, no Dominic, no business posture. She wore a gray wool coat, her hair down, her face carrying the particular tiredness of someone who had been awake past midnight, making repairs they should not have needed to make. Grace was with her, carrying nothing, That detail mattered. They were not here to conduct business. Hunter stopped. He kept Violet beside him. He had no interest in another public scene, and his foremost concern, as it had been throughout the previous evening, was what his daughter witnessed in the presence of people who had already treated him poorly once. Charlotte understood this immediately. She did not speak to Hunter first. She crouched down to Violet's eye level. "Last night," she said, in a voice that had nothing performative in it, "I said something unkind about your father in front of other people. I was wrong to say it. He was trying to keep everyone safe, and I didn't listen, and I was rude to him. I'm sorry he had to hear that." Violet regarded her with the gravity of a child who understood that apologies were facts to be evaluated against what she had seen. Then she looked up at Hunter. Hunter put his hand on his daughter's shoulder. He looked at Charlotte and said, "Thank you for telling her that." It was a small sentence. It was the exact right sentence. It told Charlotte what the wound had actually been. Not the professional slight, not the audience of colleagues, not the loss of face in a work setting. The wound had been the moment his daughter had watched him be mocked, and the healing required addressing the same witness. Charlotte stood. She said the board had requested a formal acknowledgement of Hunter's role in the previous evening. Hunter said that was not necessary. Charlotte said it had become necessary because of what Dominic had attempted to construct, and that the formal record would now reflect the actual sequence of events rather than a revised one. She gave Hunter a brief account of what Dominic had tried to build in the Denver conference room. Hunter took this in without visible reaction. He had suspected something of the sort was possible. He had not expected it to be addressed. Grace produced a letter-sized envelope. Inside was a formal offer of a part-time advisory position with the Whitman Group Travel Safety and Operational Risk Review, flexible scheduling, compensation substantially above his current rate. Charlotte said, quietly, that she had not designed the offer to purchase his forgiveness. She had designed it because someone with his background should not be in a professional position where telling the truth had no structural support behind it. Hunter held the envelope. He asked one question. Could the schedule be arranged so that he was never required to miss a school conference, a medical appointment, or pickup? Charlotte said, "That is exactly why we need you. You understand what the real priorities actually are." Dominic arrived 30 minutes after Charlotte. He had driven himself, and when he saw her car already at the FBO curb, his expression was the expression of a man who had badly misread the morning. He had come prepared with a version of the conversation, collegial, warm, a brief acknowledgement of a stressful evening, and a mutual understanding that the previous night was behind them. This was how such situations were managed. You moved early, you controlled the framing, you kept the subject feeling recognized without expanding their standing. Charlotte was standing with Hunter at the FBO entrance when Dominic walked up. The envelope had already changed hands. Dominic began to speak. Charlotte stopped him with a brief, flat look that communicated the full distance between the conversation he had planned and the one he was about to have. She did not raise her voice. She laid out the sequence clearly and without embellishment. Hunter had given an accurate safety advisory and been dismissed. Dominic had amplified the dismissal. Dominic had applied direct pressure to the captain in a manner that the company's own safety protocol did not permit. Dominic had subsequently prepared a written account attributing the evening's disruption to Hunter's interference. She said that the last item had consequences. A ground coordinator with the correct assessment had been targeted as a scapegoat for a decision Dominic himself had championed. The documentation now existed to demonstrate this in sequence and in detail. Dominic's suspension from the acquisition team was effective immediately, pending an internal conduct review. He was told to return to corporate offices. He left without speaking. It was, in its own way, the most honest exit he had made all evening. Joseph Reed had returned to Cedar Ridge that morning for a technical debrief with operations. When it ended, he found Hunter near the coordination desk, the same place where all of this had begun. Joseph extended his hand. "In this industry," he said, "a warning that gets dismissed can become a statistic. You spoke up when it would have been easier to let it go. That matters more than most people in this building will ever understand." Hunter shook his hand. He did not say much in return, but Joseph Reed's acknowledgement, one professional to another, across a gap that had been drawn artificially and was now, in this room, closed, landed in a register no board resolution could reach. Samuel Brooks and Diana Walsh watched from a few feet away. Diana smiled. Samuel gave Hunter a slow nod. They had always known what he was. Now the people who had needed to be told could not pretend otherwise. Several months later, Hunter held a part-time advisory role with the Whitman Group, reviewing travel and operational risk documents, making recommendations on routing and airport logistics for executive movement, and flagging conditions that warranted protocol changes before anyone in a suit decided to ignore them. The hours were structured around Violet's school calendar. He finished his handover at Cedar Ridge with the same care he brought to everything else, because he had not forgotten what the smaller airport had been for him during the years when getting through the week was the only ambition he could afford. Charlotte became, by most accounts, a more functional version of the leader she had been trying to be. Still precise, still decisive, but willing to stop and ask the person closest to the problem what they actually saw before deciding she already knew. It was not a personality change. It was a calibration, the kind that only comes when the cost of not having it has been made specific. Some weeks after the events at Cedar Ridge, Violet produced a drawing at the kitchen table and asked to bring it to the airport. In the drawing, a car drove through a white cloud along a road. A plane stood still on a runway, and a tall figure held the hand of a small figure. At the top, in careful child's letters, Violet had written a title. Charlotte asked what the picture was called. Violet said, "Take the safe road. That's what Daddy says." Charlotte looked at the drawing for a long time. She asked if she could keep it. Violet thought about it. Then she nodded. It went up in Charlotte's office, above the framed deal documents and the award plaques and the signed board resolutions. It was the only piece of paper in the room that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with what it had cost her to earn it. Some months after that, Charlotte was preparing for a new route. Before she approved the departure schedule, she looked across the operations table at Hunter and asked, "What do you see?" Hunter checked the weather pattern. He looked at the destination airport's equipment list. He looked at the forecast band for the corridor. He nodded once. "Clear," he said. This time, nobody laughed.